going to keep me on time, right?
I'm going to try while I do your PowerPoint and video.
Credentials, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a registered play therapist supervisor, which I'll go into a little bit about play therapy later in the presentation. And I'm also EMDR certified, so I will go into that as well. It's another type of therapy that I do. My background, as Joe mentioned, I've worked for advocacy centers for about 20 years. And then last year I went out on my own and I'm doing private practice now. So I have a little bit more variety. I've been doing primarily sexual abuse for 20 years. So after that, you need a little variety in your life. And I'm actually enjoying the variety. So go ahead and flip it. Feel free to interrupt with questions. It's much more interesting if it's interactive. So just jump in at any time. You can go ahead and go, Joe.
Sorry.
So these are just some things that I wanted to talk about today. Doesn't bother me at all. Child abuse indicators. Joe wanted me to focus primarily on sexual abuse, how abuse impacts kids, how it impacts the brain, and how you guys can help in different types of therapy. So that's kind of what we'll be covering today. So just to start off with, this is just an interesting graph that I found. If you add it up, it doesn't add up to 100%. And that's because, as you guys are probably learning through your training, when cases come in for abuse, there's actually more than one on the report. So it'll be neglect and sexual abuse, or physical abuse and sexual abuse. So that's why the numbers don't add up to 100%. But if you'll notice that neglect is 78%. It's the biggest one, and it's actually the worst type of abuse that you can have, because, as we'll go into a little bit later, how it affects the brain. So it is the most traumatic. So sexual abuse indicators, a lot of times people come in and they expect to see physical injuries. Parents will come in and take their kiddos to the doctor and they expect that there's going to be tearing or scars or what have you. It's actually very rare that that happens. Very, very rare. Because the genitalia is kind of like the inside of your mouth. And if you bite your lip or bite your cheek and have mouth sore, it goes away kind of by the next day. So the genitalia is kind of like that as well. It's the same kind of tissue. So typically you don't see the physical injuries with sexual abuse. Every once in a while, but very rare. What you are going to see is a lot of sexual acting out, kids that don't have good boundaries. Like they may just meet you and come over and want to sit on your lap. And we're going to talk about how to handle that. Regressive behavior, thumb sucking. I've had teenagers that sucked pacifiers or wanted bottles. Rocking behavior because it's soothing. The unexplained fears or panic attacks. Great story to illustrate that one. A long time ago when I was working in Houston at the Advocacy Center, we had 2 foster kids. And they were doing beautifully in a foster home. They were sisters, they loved the foster parents, everything was going great. And one day the foster dad came down in overalls. He was going to go out and do the yard. And one of the sisters went into a corner, started screaming, crying, couldn't be consoled. Luckily, we had the older sister who was able to tell the foster mom that every time the perpetrator abused them, he wore overalls.
Oh, wow.
So things as simple as facial hair or a certain perfume, actually scents are even more strong than anything visual. But those can lead to lots of unexplained fears. So I've had kids that couldn't go into a bathroom because that's where the abuse happened, was in a bathroom. So whenever you have some fears that just don't seem right, you kind of want to go into that a little bit more and find out what's going on there. Lots of anxiety and nightmares, and we'll go into a little bit more later, but the nightmares are kind of the body's way of replaying it and trying to make sense out of it. So they'll wake up or not be able to get to sleep at all at night because that's when their mind starts running, is when they lay down on their pillow. Any personality changes in kiddos? I've had really outgoing, vivacious children become very, very shy and quiet. Or you might have the opposite, and you might have a historically very shy child become very outgoing and just all over the place. So if you see a drastic personality change, that's usually a sign that something's going on. You need to dig a little deeper. Of course, school problems, and again, it goes both ways. I've had kids that were honor roll students and threw everything that they had into school to make those A's because they didn't want to think about what was going on at home. Or you have kids that are so distracted by what's going on at home they can't focus at all. But usually one extreme or the other. Loss of appetite, they just can't eat. They've got all this anxious, nervous energy and they just don't want to eat. And we also see a lot of self-mutilation. A lot of people get really scared with self-mutilation. And it can cross over into suicidal stuff, but typically what kids are telling me is it's a release. So when they cut, it releases the same endorphins as if you went out jogging. So it gives them that natural high and makes them feel better temporarily, helps them get all those yucky feelings out. All right, some general indicators. And again, we're going to go into a lot more of this, so I'm kind of zipping through them right now. But disturbed metabolism is about the brain. If you have trauma as a child, it affects the way your brain develops. And therefore, your brain is the connections are all jumbled, it's disorganized, it doesn't develop the way it should. It kind of misses some steps in the way. So you're going to get disturbed metabolism. So they'll have these problems feeding, eating, breathing. We see a lot of kids with abuse issues that have asthma. And it's not because of genetics, it's because of trauma they've been through. The affectionate behaviors, again, those kids that just don't have boundaries and they're trying to hug on you. I had a little girl recently that came in before I could even stop her, planted a kiss right on my cheek. So you get those kind of boundary issues. Again, with the anxiety, lots of anger. So these kids just, they can't get angry at the perpetrator. It's not safe. So they're going to get angry at people that are safe, which might be you guys as volunteers or their foster parents or sibling. That's where the anger is going to come out. The problems with transitions is also a brain thing that we're going to get into. But transitions are really difficult for kiddos, especially with trauma. So even going to lunch at school can be a time when they go off. So a lot of times when I talk to teachers or counselors are like, they're going to recess and they're going crazy. It's because it's a change, and anything that's a change is new and scary. Even if it's something you did yesterday, it's still new and scary. You're also going to see poor impulse control. They just don't know how to control themselves, and especially when they're feeling safe, it's going to be even harder. If they're scared, they're in control. But when they get to school and things are safe, woohoo, I can let it go for a little while. I can just kind of be free. Unable to identify or control feelings. I remember one of the first kiddos I ever worked with. I was doing a volunteer job when I was in undergrad. And he came into a group I was doing. He was 5 years old, and he couldn't identify what a happy face was. He didn't know that it was happy. These kids have turned off their feelings so many times during the abuse. They've had to shut it down. That they don't know how to feel, they don't know how to identify them. So even happy is a hard one to identify, much less angry or frustrated or all the other little nuanced feelings there are. Defiant or overly compliant, again with those extremes, they're going to be trying to please you and wanting you to love on them and give them lots of attention and doing anything you ask them to do. Or they're going to go the other extreme and not want to do anything that any adult tells them to do. They're just going to rebel. So look for the extremes is basically the big picture here. You go ahead. So these are all signs of unhealthy attachments. We'll get to the attachments next. Manipulating other people to get control. If the adults in my life haven't been good and haven't followed through with things, I haven't been able to rely on them, well then forget the adults, I'm taking control. I'm going to call the shots here because I know how to do it better than they do. They might not know how to engage others because, again, if they've shut down their feelings and emotions, how do you go and be friends with somebody? It's hard to engage if you aren't in touch with yourself. Again, trying to be the adult. Lying, stealing, and hoarding. Lots of that behavior. So hoarding food, hiding it under their mattresses. Usually signs of neglect. If they've gone through neglect, they don't trust that their needs are going to be met, so they're hoarding that stuff to make sure they can meet their own needs. And that takes a long time to get over, a whole long time to get over. I've got a kiddo right now that I'm working with he was adopted from Russia, and he was adopted before 18 months, and he's now 10, and he's still hoarding. So lots of time to get over that one. Rocking, headbanging, other repetitive self-soothing things, they're going back to early childhood experiences and trying to comfort themselves. So if you see a kiddo just holding themselves and rocking, well, what did your mama do when you were a baby? Held and rocked, right? So it's a soothing, comforting experience that reduces that anxiety. Unwilling to verbalize thoughts or feelings, again, can't talk about those feelings. And then trouble relying on others because they haven't been there. Just plain and simple, they haven't been there. So how does it impact the child? Unfortunately, the most common place for kiddos to be abused is in their homes. Less than 1% is that stranger danger that we hear about all over the place. It's mostly at home. And those are the very people who should be preventing it and providing the nurturing and love. So you get this conflict going on with these kiddos. So in order to appreciate the impact on the brain, you have to understand attachment first. So let's go into that. So the attachment cycle, and this is just very basic stuff. As a child, as a baby, you have a need. You're hungry. You signal discomfort and you start crying. And hopefully somebody meets that need and brings you a bottle. And then you're cooing and all happy until you have a need again. When this cycle goes around as it should, and every time you have a need, it's met, not immediately, but within a reasonable time frame, you get security, you get trust, and you get attachment. You start to believe that the world is a safe place, and when you have a need and you voice that need, somebody's going to meet it for you. The problems come in when this is not met. So you have the need and you're crying, and sometimes people come or sometimes they don't. So, have you ever gone to restaurants and seen those babies in the carriers and they're sitting on the ground and they've been there for 2 hours and not made a peep? And people always go, oh, what a good baby. No. That's a baby whose need hasn't been met. There's no point in crying because nobody ever brings me the bottle. So what's the point? I'm just going to sit here and wait because they're going to feed me when they want to. So babies need to cry. They have a need. They need to cry. They need that need satisfied, and this needs to continue for them to be able to trust the world. When it doesn't happen, you see that when they're older, and you guys are going to see this in visits. You guys ever monitor visits?
Yes.
Okay, so when you have parents come in to visit their the kids in foster care, sometimes you're going to see kiddos that will run up to you when they get injured or they're upset about something instead of going to the mom or the dad who's visiting. That's an attachment issue. Mom and dad didn't meet this need, so I'm not going to them. I'm going to go to this other lady that I barely know because she's more likely to help me. I saw that a lot when I did CPS visits, and kids would come to me and I'd be like trying to push them in, go see your mom, mom's here to visit with you. They didn't want to have anything to do with mom. So those are the kinds of things you want to watch for in visits is, what is that attachment? Are they happy to see mom? Do they cry when they leave? Because they should. When you're leaving somebody you love, you should cry. If they don't care, that's something to put in your court reports for the judge to see. And you don't have to have the technical terms, you just,
Is it being added to parenting classes these days that's pretty important to check in when a baby's crying? I just in my lifetime heard so many women, oh, you got to let babies cry. You're going to spoil them. You're going to spoil a baby, an infant. And
my coworker had a great meme that she posted on her website today. You don't spoil a child with your presence. You spoil a child with presents,
that's
gifts.
a good way. Mm-hmm.
That's how you spoil a child. Being there for a child doesn't spoil a child.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to learn how to self-soothe, and some will learn faster than others. My ADHD daughter learned when she was probably about 4 or 5 how to self-soothe, and it was rough. It was a rough 4 to 5 years, but she just couldn't do it. My other child came out of the womb knowing how to self-soothe, plug in that thumb, and she was good to go. But my older one, she couldn't do it. It took her a long time. She's great at it now.
Yeah.
But we had to be patient. If we had rushed that, she never would have gotten there. So, I don't know if it's in parenting courses. It absolutely should be.
It should be. Well, I had a very close relationship with a teenage mom, and she was always getting that message from both grandmothers to not spoil the baby, and I would just tell her, babies don't spoil, only fruit and vegetables spoil.
That's good.
But anyway, this is the reason without knowing it, I knew it.
Yeah. And babies are going to, like I said, they're going to learn to self-soothe. They're not going to cry all the time and want you to pick them up all the time. They're going to learn to entertain themselves. It just takes time. Some longer than others, like my baby. All right, so I'm going to talk a lot about Child Trauma Academy. On your resources at the back is a website where you guys can go. It's a great resource for you. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist that used to practice at Baylor in Houston, and he now has this Child Trauma Academy, and there are, last time I was on there anyway, some free webinars that you guys can do, And they're really good about brain development and how trauma affects brains and things like that. So I'm going to refer to his work a lot today. But what he says is, it's the attachment quantity, how many attachments somebody has, plus the quality, how strong those attachments are. And here's the really cool part, your genetic makeup. So, some of us are just naturally more resilient because of our genetics. And here's the neat part, the epigenetics. Epigenetics are what happened to your parents before you were even thought of. So, if mom is a victim of domestic violence, her genetic makeup gets altered because of the stress she endures. If she doesn't get therapy, it stays altered. That can then pass on to a child, even if she's been out of the relationship for 5 or 10 years before she ever has that baby. If she's moved on to a healthy relationship and things are good, it still affects her DNA, which then passes down to the child, and it affects how the child copes with stress. So, all of those factors together determine how resilient a child is going to be.
And you said it actually affects your DNA?
It affects
Wow.
your DNA. If you look up epigenetics and YouTube, there's a great video on rats and how epigenetics works. And they did it with color of rats, and it's very interesting. And size, like the rats were skinny or fat and different colors. But it can continue for generations if people don't get therapy and get healthy.
Right. So it's very important to go back and kind of
Do your own work.
revisit that area and get it healed before moving on. Okay.
Absolutely. Not everybody needs therapy for that. I'm a therapist, so I happen to think
Right.
that's the best way, but there are people that can heal themselves, but you just have to do the work and heal.
So it sounds
I
like
agree.
none of us should have kids.
I think everybody should have, those parenting classes for psychologicals or something before. But that's, if I was president, that's what I'd have happen. Go ahead, Jim. All right, so just some different lenses for you guys to look at when you get your kiddos that you're working with. It's really important to kind of figure out where they are on different scales. So one thing you want to take into consideration is just developmental milestones. And, I've had a lot of cases that I've been stumped on, and when I just, open it up to the theories, I've got a whole little folder that I keep of just different theories. And I look them up, and I'm like, oh, wow, okay, this kid's 10, and they should be here, but they're back here. It can explain a lot about what you're seeing in the kids and what their needs are. So really check out, motor development. Another example, if my children ever came to these things, they'd hate me because I always use them as examples, but my ADHD child, she couldn't ride a bike until she was like 6. So she just didn't have the motor coordination that most kids have. So her baby sister actually started riding before she did. Language development, are they speaking where they should? Or do they have all the sentences and stuff that they should have for their age? Learning, that's pretty self-explanatory. The social, emotional. So are they still parallel playing? Are they playing next to somebody and not interacting with them, but they're 10? That's a problem, because that's what you do when you're a toddler. Are they interacting? Do they want to do sleepovers? Do they want to go have fun times with their friends? Are they acting their age? Because a lot of these kids they're going to be way back here just because of all the transitions they've gone through, because of the abuse they've gone through. They're going to be back here when they should be up here. So you want to look at things to try to catch them up. And they can catch up pretty quickly if you're giving them the right tools to do so. Self-help is a big one. I've got big kids that come into my office and go, can you tie my shoes after they take off their shoes in my session? You should be tying your shoes by about 5. So you want to look at things like that. And sometimes that's, I need nurturing. And so they want that nurturing from you, and tying the shoes is kind of a nurturing thing. The moral development, you want to see where they are on right and wrong and how they perceive those things. And if you Google these things, you can find all the different theories out there and print them up for yourself and make a folder. It can be really helpful. Another one to look at is Maslow. If you guys have ever been through a natural disaster, you're going to understand this. You can't get up here to be self-actualization for Maslow is just being all that you can be, using every gift that you've got to its maximum potential. You are not going to get up here until you start down here. If you don't have food, water, clothing, and shelter, you cannot go up here to feel safe and secure. You can't start giving love and accepting love because you're still down here trying to get this need met. So with a lot of the foster kids, you're going to have foster parents go, well, we're loving them so much, why can't they love us back? Well, they're still wondering where the clothing is coming from. They're still wondering if they're getting that next voucher to go get some more clothes. They're still wondering where their favorite things are from their house that they didn't get to take with them. So if they're stuck here, then they can't show you love up here. And if you guys have been through a natural disaster, you know this is where you get stuck. I got stuck in Big Bend over Thanksgiving last year with a broken down car, and I guarantee you, food was my first thing. Where's the nearest store I can walk to get food, because we were running out. And shelter was my next thing. So where can I put up my camper, because I'm stuck. So safety, security, hugging on my kids, it was not there. Where's the store? I need the store. I need my sandwich, you know, my peanut butter and jelly and my bread. So this is where the kids are. So looking at here, you know, making sure that they feel secure here before they can move up. Go ahead, Jim. Bruce Perry again has a similar triangle, but he talks about attachments. So you have to have attachments first before you can move up, before you can self-regulate and monitor your behavior in classroom. If you can't attach, then you're not going to have that self-control needed in the classroom, and teachers are going to be fussing at you all the time. You can't affiliate with others. You can't develop relationships. You can't attune, so you're not going to know how other people feel. You're not going to be able to read their body language, their facial expressions. So when that teacher's mad at you at the front of the class, you're not picking up on it, because you're back down here and you're still trying to attach. I have a great example of that right now that I'm working with. A little kid just finished kindergarten, had a horrible year, and parents brought him into me like 2 weeks before the end of the year. And when I talked to the teacher before she left for summer, I said, I just need your input. He's right here. He's still trying to attach to her. He was trying to please her. He wanted to have her all to himself. And she thought he was up here. She was like, well, you know, I'm giving him the look, and I'm, you know, giving him the little signs, and he's not picking up on it. He's not up there. He's way down here. So if you can explain this kind of stuff to teachers and foster parents, then they start to understand and have more empathy and more patience. After attunement, you get tolerance. So tolerance for people who are different. A lot of people aren't there yet, right? And then respect for others, no matter what beliefs or whatever they have, just genuine respect. Grief and loss is another thing to think about with these kiddos, because I know as a former CPS person, you go out and you pick up the kids and you put them in a foster home, and very little, if anything, is said to them, because you really don't have a whole lot of time or information. So the big mistake that sometimes CPS makes is thinking, oh, it's the sibling. They weren't abused themselves, so they don't have any issues, right? I've seen a lot of those kids come through my system where they didn't have the abuse happen to them, so nothing's wrong. Well, they're also grieving. They're grieving the loss of their parents, of their siblings, of maybe the first 5 foster homes they've been to, of their favorite stuffed animal that's at home. What makes this difficult, you know, these are the stages of grief and loss that everybody goes through. And most adults, you've had a loss in your life and you've had to go through those. Little kids don't have that. They don't have that experience. And so it really scares them. And they don't know what to do with all those feelings. So you get a kiddo that's grieving. And how do we know how to grieve? We watch our parents, right? Can you remember being little and having a family pet die or a grandparent die, and you watched your mom and dad to figure out, what do we do? How do we do this? What are the rituals around it? Well, in a foster home, the foster parents aren't grieving. So you don't have anybody to watch. You're not getting a whole lot of information, so you don't know if they're coming back tomorrow, if they're coming back in 2 weeks, 2 months. It's really difficult, and it gets very complicated for these kids to grieve. The other factor here is that a lot of times grief in little kids looks like ADHD. So they have all this turmoil and all these feelings, and they go crazy because they don't know what to do with it. You're rarely going to see them sitting and crying if they're grieving. It's going to be this outward expression. And so then what does the foster care system try to do? Oh, we need to medicate. Let's give this long list of medications to this child who's just going through a normal grieving process. Most of the kids that you guys will see will have PTSD. PTSD came about, you probably know, from veterans coming back from war and the stuff that they were going through, right? With kids, it's a little bit different and a little bit more intense, actually. They were trying to get a new diagnosis in this latest DSM called developmental trauma. Because if you have an adult and you ship the adult off to war and they see horrible, horrible things, their brain is already developed. So you're showing them these horrible things with a developed brain. As opposed to a child whose brain is still in development, it affects the structure differently. So PTSD with little kids is much more traumatic than with adults who are going through it. It's much more pervasive. So what you're going to see these 3 different types of symptoms. So hyperarousal, they're just on all the time. So they can't sleep because they can't calm down. They're constantly watching their environment to see if there's danger. So if I was abused by a guy in overalls, I'm constantly checking the room. Anybody in overalls? Anybody in overalls? I'm just looking all the time. So in classrooms, you're going to see these kids watching the door. You know, anytime there's movement in the hallway or somebody's coming through the door, they've got to watch and see if they're still safe. It's not a conscious thing they do, it's very unconscious, but they're still looking around and they're not focused on their work. They're going to be irritable and angry, and of course have difficulty concentrating because they're too busy trying to make sure they're safe. The numbing, they're going to go to sleep and it looks like they're really depressed. They're sleeping all the time, can't really rouse them, they're very distant, they just seem really far off, not connecting with people, and sometimes they actually physically withdraw. They just want to be by themselves. The re-experiencing is what I was talking about earlier. So that is trying to make sense out of the world. So I thought the world was round, and now this abuse happened, and I'm finding out it's square. I've got to make that make sense in my brain. So what they're going to do is repetitive play, playing it over and over in their play. Nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts during the day where it's just they're sitting in class and all of a sudden they're thinking about the abuse. And somatization, which is the body. So the body is going to react. Really great story. I was an early play therapist and just learning how to do play therapy, and I had a kiddo that was about 7 come in, and he would never talk to me. We had a sand tray of these big old army men that were about this big. He would line them up in the sand and use the dart gun and shoot them down over and over and over. I can't even tell you how many times in an hour. But I was like, oh, I'm bored to death and I'm not doing this kid any good. Kept staffing it with my supervisor, and she said, just keep doing it. Keep doing it. It's what he needs to do. I was like, there's got to be something else. Well, one day I get a call from his not his foster parent, his CPS worker. And she said, guess what? He just disclosed to me that the foster family had been locking him in a closet and not feeding him. And I said, oh my gosh, okay. So they investigated, closed down the foster home, got him safe. And I said, well, are you bringing him back? She said, oh yeah, we're bringing him back. He came back to therapy with me, never touched the army guys again, never touched the gun again. He played in the sand, but this time he was using Play-Doh and making pancakes and feeding me, pretend food here, and talking to me. It's the first time I'd ever heard his voice. So over those months, he worked through what he needed to work through to get up the courage to tell who he needed to tell. I felt completely useless in that session, but apparently I was giving him the space to do what he needed to do. And sometimes you have to trust that process. It was an amazing story, and he ended up doing really well. With the somatization, when I was a CPS worker, I used to always go to the nurse's office. That was my first stop in the school. Because 99% of the time, the nurses knew these kids, from headaches, stomach aches, whatever. I never really understood why until I went to a training one time, and they said, well, there's this vagus nerve that runs down your spine, and when you're traumatized, when the trauma is triggered, it sends a signal down that nerve, creates headaches, stomach aches, body aches, hence they go to the nurse a lot. So usually these kids would sit in the nurse, 30 minutes, whatever, rest on a bed, and then go back to class when they calm down. So that's what you're going to see with somatization. Any questions?
Some of this sounds like kids that could be autistic too. I mean, we're gonna have to figure out, or if they're autistic, will they have been
What sounds like
diagnosed?
autism?
I don't know, the daydreaming, distant, the depression. My sister has a grandson who's going through
Yeah.
some of that, and he just got diagnosed as being autistic. And so, and it's similar.
Usually
Some
the
of
kids
this
come in, they
is-
have to have a psychological, right, Joe?
Not always.
Not always?
Most of the time they do.
Okay, so psychological should pick up on that.
Should
And if
come
you have
up.
concerns about it, then I would definitely be raising it with your CASA supervisor and let them know.
Okay.
Y'all as volunteers, you're not here to diagnose
Right.
or
No,
to
we
figure
can do
out
that.
everything, but you're here to raise questions. And if you see something or something just doesn't feel right, that's when you go to the CPS worker, you go
flag.
to your supervisor, and you start talking it over.
Yeah.
Absolutely. John,
You're saying going to the nurse is a great idea. I wrote it down so that I could use it.
Yeah, yeah, usually I would just go in and say, hey, do you know this kid? And they'd say, oh yeah, they come in all the time. Okay, that's, that was just a little bit of information to add to it. And some of it might be needing nurturing too, and nurses are
Right.
great to get nurturing from. And it's a quiet place. That's where I tell a lot of my traumatized kids to go if they're overstimulated during the day. Go to the nurse's office and just lay down for a few minutes. Calm yourself down and then go back to class. It's a great safe place in school. So, all right. So during trauma, what happens is we have this fight, flight, freeze, and faint. Basically, what your brain does, and this is information that I tell all my traumatized kids because it makes them feel less guilty about what they did. When you go through a trauma, whether it's a car crash or whether it's sexual abuse, within seconds of realizing that there's a trauma about to happen, your brainstem takes over. Your thinking part, your cortex up here, it's offline. It is not working whatsoever. Your brainstem kicks in, and that's the part that controls your breathing and your digestion and all those things that we think nothing about during the day, right? It takes over and it takes in all the sensory information in milliseconds. And it decides what you're going to do. Not your thinking part of your brain. So I have a girl right now that I'm working with that was just sexually assaulted in her house with her parents in the house by a moving guy. He grabbed her, took her into a closet and sexually assaulted her. And what she keeps telling me, she's 14 years old. She keeps telling me, why didn't I call? Why didn't I scream? My dad would come running. Why didn't I? Why didn't I? Why didn't I? And what I've had to tell her, this wasn't working. You weren't sitting there going, what are my options? This base brain was trying to get you through it. Not keep you from getting assaulted, not keep you from going into a car wreck, but how do you get through it alive? That's what that base part of your brain is supposed to do, is keep you alive. So, within those milliseconds, your body decides how it's going to react. Whether it's going to fight or flee. And when I talk to kids about this, I talk about animals. Whether you're going to be a lion and you're going to stay and you're going to attack, or you're going to flee like a deer and run. What happens, it's really cool in the body, is if you're going to do those things, your body instantly starts pumping blood, pumping adrenaline. It gets you all geared up and you are ready to go. You're ready to go fight. You're ready to go take on whatever. If your body decides that you should freeze or faint, it does the exact opposite. It actually pulls most of your blood into your core so that if you are being attacked by that lion and it bites your arm, you're not going to bleed out as fast. It gives you a chance at survival. It's very cool how our bodies work that way. But freezing and fainting, kids will actually, they literally freeze. They cannot do anything. Sometimes they pass out and they just lose consciousness. And they're actually freezing. I talk about bunnies and how they'll freeze and stay really still. And your body actually slows down your heart, because if you're freezing, you don't want a heartbeat that's doing this, right? So it will actually calm your heart down, pull all that blood into the center, and you can freeze. Fainting, there's actually a goat that does that. Y'all ever heard about the fainting goats? When they get scared, they just fall over, right? So just like the animals, we respond in the same way, because it's the animal part of our brain that's taken over. So what this leads to, if you are doing fight or flight, then you're going to have a tendency to be hyper-aroused after the trauma, because you were hyper-aroused during the trauma. So you're going to be the one who's more vigilant and looking, more outward with your expressions, more angry maybe. If you froze or you fainted, you're going to tend to dissociate. So you're going to kind of go off in your own little world when you get triggered. So the body continues to do what it did during the trauma for the most part. Kind of cool how that works, huh? So kids, this girl that I'm working with, she's dissociating a lot. She's sitting in class and she's off in her own world and she can't even tell me where she went to. But that's what she did during the trauma, is she froze. The other thing that happens is neurotransmitters affect all these different parts of your brain when you go through a trauma. So, and I'm not going to go through all the technical stuff because I don't have it memorized. Brain is very complicated. But the amygdala is your feeling part of your brain, so it makes your emotions more intense. Cortex is your thinking part, so it affects that because you get these dumps of neurotransmitters, right? Hippocampus is where your memory's at. So I know I'm often called on to testify in court And, well, why does the kid remember that it was nighttime, but she can't remember what she was wearing? Because these neurotransmitters messed up her memory. And she's got pieces of it, but not a full picture. And kids get really frustrated too. I had a girl that I worked with for several years who went through years of abuse by her grandfather, and that was the most frustrating, irritating thing to her, is these gaps in her memory, that she couldn't piece it all together. And so she doubted her own story. So when you explain this stuff to kids, and then, when I went through it, and I had to go through it many times, I think I worked with her for 3 years before she went off to college. But finally she was like, it's just never coming back, is it? And I'm like, it's not, because it's damaged. That part of that memory is damaged because of all those neurotransmitters that got dumped. And the best you can do is piece it together for yourself and make a story for yourself. So that's what she ended up doing. But all those neurotransmitters, it just messes up how they remember it, all their feelings about it. This is why you get kids that are very sexually active, because it messes up that part of their brain too. So it makes a lot of sense when you look into it. This is another Bruce Perry thing. It's the easiest way to explain it. All right, so we talked about freeze and faint, flight and fight. So here's your fight and flight, your hyperarousal. Let's see where to start here. Okay, so if you're aggressive, if you get all the way, let me back up. All right, so when something triggers you, you kind of go up and you stay up, right? If something doesn't calm you down, like therapy, like self-soothing things, you're going to stay kind of hyper-aroused on the extreme. Here's the extreme, is aggression. So these kids who fought or fled during the trauma, they're going to be very aggressive. So you might see them getting into fights at school, things like that, right? When they're in aggression, their functional IQ, meaning they could be completely average normally, but where their IQ goes down to is the MR range, 60 to 70. So when they are all aggressive and ready for that fight and just fighting everybody because they can't deal with their feelings, they're at an MR level. They have no sense of time whatsoever. So when you're trying to rationalize with these kids and you're going, okay, let's think about the consequences, they're like, well, consequences, whatever. Can't think about it. They can't think about what's going to happen in 5 minutes. They have no sense of time when they're that hyper-aroused and aggressive. You calm them down a little bit, you get defiance and tantrums, and their IQ actually increases. And they can think in minutes and seconds. You go all the way down when they're at rest and they're calm. They can think about college. They can think about all those extended plans they want to have. They have an average IQ, right? So a lot of times I get volunteers asking, well, I'm trying to plan for college with these kids and they're just not listening, they're not talking to me. It's because they're down here, they don't have any sense of time. You got to get them calmed down before you can do those kinds of things. You have to get them calmed down before we can do therapy. So a lot of times when they come in, we have to do calming exercises before we can even start with therapy, just to get them somewhere around this area for therapy. If they froze or fainted, you're going to have the dissociative. So you're going to have the extreme is fainting, where they're dissociated, they're just kind of spaced out, rocking back and forth. They're just kind of robotic, going through the motions, but not really there. Avoidance, and then when they're resting. You can also look at what brain regions are on. So here, when they're aggressive or they're fainting, the only thing that's working is their brainstem. That's it. It's that animal brain. They are totally reflexive, so they're just reacting to everything, and they are in terror. That's the extreme. You get them down here, you get to the midbrain, you get a little bit more reactive, and you get some fear. Limbic system is your feelings, so they're more emotional, and this is where they're just in alarm. Right here is where we want to do therapy, between arousal and alarm. If they come in too calm, we got to get them hyped up a little bit. We got to remind them about the trauma, which sounds really mean, but you don't make changes when you're here. You make changes here. So that's where you want to do therapy. Any questions about this? No? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so basically the traumatized child processes the world differently because they're wired differently. They get all of these connections mixed up, and they have to go through therapy to get them back on the right track. So that's what we're doing in therapy, is trying to correct the connections that they have. So of course, like we just talked about, you're gonna get, if they're already hyper aroused, you're gonna get those less mature styles of dealing with problems. You're gonna get the fighting and the aggression and the kicking and the screaming, all of those things. Because that's all they can do at that point. So how can you guys help? Being present, and as volunteers that, you know, I know you're going through these classes and you're like, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? Just you being you is so incredibly valuable, I can't tell you. Being that one person that they can connect to, that they can trust, it is so important for you guys just to be there for them. You know, to be there when you say you're gonna be there, because, you know, a lot of times adults haven't followed through. So I've seen volunteers that just built a relationship on nothing but just doing what they say they're gonna do. So if I say I'm gonna be there Tuesday at 5, I'm there Tuesday at 5 to see you. And that is more powerful than you can absolutely realize. Just, it goes so far. Using your voice, just talking to them, being there for them, being interested in them. Because so often these kids, nobody asks them, what are your hopes, what are your dreams, what do you want to do? What do you think about this? Not that that's always going to happen, you know, what do you think, where do you think you would want to live if you could live anywhere? Well, you know, living on a cloud might not actually happen, but you know what, I can listen to you and I can hear you. And that is so, so powerful. Using touch in a healthy way is really good, and you know, you always want to ask before you touch because these kids have had their boundaries violated. But if they're open to a hug, you know, if I see a kiddo crying and they're just really distraught, I'll ask them, would you like a hug? Would that be helpful? And they'll tell you yes or no. And if it's no, then ask, you know, can I pat you on the back? No. Okay. Can I just sit here with you? But just offering the touch is sometimes very healing because you're respecting their boundary. And many people haven't done that for them. Giving them predictability and control. Everything for these kids feels out of control. They feel like they don't know anything about what's going on. They don't have control over anything. So a lot of times they'll give foster parents a really hard time because they're trying to grasp at some kind of control, whether it's arguing about some little snack that they've got or hoarding or whatever. They're trying to gain that control. So the ways that I always tell foster parents to do this is put a calendar, give them control over their calendar. Doesn't mean they get to choose what they do, but if they've got a doctor's appointment in 2 weeks and you put it on the calendar and every day before that you remind them, hey, next week I'm picking you up early on Thursday for that doctor's appointment, remember? Hey, next week I'm picking you up early. Every day you remind them, they've got some control over that. They've had time to prepare, and it's not scary, it's not change. They know it's coming. They've been planning for it for a week and a half. They're okay when it gets there. You tell them the day before, hey, tomorrow I need to pick you up early for a doctor's appointment, they're going nuts. Even if they want to get out of school, they're going nuts because it's change, it's scary, no control, you're just yanking me and pulling me and doing something else with me. But if you give them that predictability and let them plan for something, it just goes much smoother, much, much smoother.
It's the same for my grandmother with Alzheimer's. So.
Yeah. Don't all of us want predictability and control? I know I like control over my calendar. I look ahead to see what's going on. Clear and simple directives, just being very basic with them. You know, you don't want to, it's kind of like having an ADHD child. You don't want to give them like 10 things that they need to do because they're already overwhelmed. They're not ADHD, but they're overwhelmed and they've got too much going on. So giving them, hey, we need to get this one thing done. Okay, great, that's done. Okay, now we need to move to this next thing. So that is helpful. When you're talking to these kids, using open-ended questions, not closed-ended where it's a yes, no, or a, you know, there's one little answer. Give them the range to talk about it. You know, what do you think about this? Leave it open and let them talk. Because when you let them talk and they actually feel heard, you're going to get more information than if you asked a million closed-ended questions. You're going to really find out what their heart is. The regulating activities. To calm down, remember how we had that chart and I was telling you we've got to get down here to calm down and to really be able to function? Patterned regulating activities is what helps to calm down. So if you look at Bruce Perry's website, he's going to talk a lot about that. So you want something repetitive and patterned. So for instance, rocking is a great thing to calm kids down. Drumming is a great thing. It's back and forth, it's rhythmic. I can't talk anymore today. It's rhythmic and it's the back and forth, repetitive. It's very calming. Listening to an iPod listening to their music and just going back and forth with their music. So when you have kids going through changes and their transitions are tough for them, this is a really good thing to recommend to teachers. So I have teachers that will have kids, 5 minutes into recess. The rest of the class goes to recess, and they stay in the room and they can listen to their iPod for 5 minutes, or they can rock in the teacher's rocking chair for 5 minutes. And then they're able to make that transition more smoothly because they've calmed their central nervous system down. Same thing for coming back from lunch or going to PE class or their art classes or whatever. Just a couple of minutes of that patterned, repetitive stuff will help them calm down. And you can get really creative with it. I usually try to figure out what their interests are and kind of go with that. So, you're not going to have a teenager rocking in a rocking chair, but they might want to go out and swing on the swing set. So you want to look at something that's developmentally appropriate, but still gives them that rhythmic stuff. Providing safety seems pretty basic. Safety can be, like I was talking about before, just being able to trust you with what you do is what you say you're going to do. So I had, I'm going to get to this later, so I'll save that story. It's really powerful. We'll get to it in a minute. Decreasing the power differential, not standing above them, getting down on their level. If they're sitting in a chair, you get down and you kneel so that you're eye to eye with them. Towering over a child is very intimidating. Lucky for me, I'm short, so I don't have to get down too much. I have a lot of kids that are taller than me, so I have to look up at them. But anything you can do to decrease that power differential, they'll come in, and I've had kids, and I'm not a doctor, but they'll always try to call me doctor. Nope, it's not doctor. I'm Karen. You can call me Miss Karen. Miss Sullivan. No, I don't like that either, because that's a power thing. I'm above you, and that when you're trying to develop a rapport with kids, you need to be eye to eye with them, not above them. So sitting on the floor with them, using your first name, letting them call you, whatever, decreases that power differential. You're going to get much further with them. And then expressive therapies we're going to go into. Love that picture. All right, so play therapy. Any questions so far? No? How are we doing on time?
Good.
Play therapy, kids don't come in and sit on my couch and dangle their little feet and talk. They just don't do it. They don't care to. Toys and play are how kids communicate. So if you have any healthy kids in your life, hopefully you do because you're going to need them for self-care. But those healthy kids, you've probably seen them play with Barbies or play with action figures and act things out, right? And sometimes when you sit and watch them, they're acting out something that's going on in their life. Something they've seen on TV, something might be real. That's what kids do. They act things out to try to figure them out. So play therapy actually builds on the natural way that kids learn and communicate. It also provides that safe distance from the problems through a metaphor. So instead of talking about how you're fighting with your sister, ooh, that Barbie's fighting with that one. So you're giving it a little bit of distance, and it's easier to talk about. So kids will problem solve. Oh yeah, well what could she do? It seems like her sister's really beating up on her. What can she do? Oh, she could do this, she could do that. But if you make it about them, they shut down. It's too close, it's too personal, and they don't know. It gets really overwhelming. But talking about the toys, they'll talk to you all day about problem solving. So toys are a great way for you to connect with kids when you go out on your visits. Just little toys. You can do a little bag with some Play-Doh and some crayons. When I do home visits, that's usually what's in my bag. Play-Doh, crayons, some paper. You don't need too much more than that. Maybe some fidgety toys. So you guys don't have any, but those little koosh balls or whatever, those are great. Paper clips, because teenagers will sit there and hook them together. And if they're fiddling with their hands, their mouths are going to talk. So great rapport building. This is the play therapy room at the Advocacy Center in Fort Bend. And so as you can see, you've got a lot of toys that we do get them, just at regular stores. So you've got blocks, we had Legos in there, the little bang block thing, toolkit, musical instruments, all the dress-up clothes, puppets, hats, lots of things you just get at a regular toy store. But when you take kids into play therapy room, you give them free rein. So what most people do is called non-directive therapy, non-directive play. And so what I would do when I'd walk into a room with a kiddo is say, this is my special playroom, and in here you can do a lot of the things that you'd like to do. It's really interesting to see what kids would do on that first visit, because a lot of kids would come and sit down in this chair and just sit there and wait. They had no idea how to free play, which is an attachment thing. If you don't have healthy attachments, then you don't have that ability to just, ooh, let's jump in and see what we want to do. They would sit there and wait for somebody to tell them what to do. So Gary Landreth is a play therapist. He's kind of like the Mr. Rogers of play therapy. And he usually says that kids are either wound too tight or too loosely. So the kids who would come in and sit here, I would have to unwind them because they needed to learn to play, to spontaneously just go into a room and play. And then other kids you get, and they go in there and they destroy everything, and those you need to help them to establish some self-control and wind up a little bit. So one case that I had, it was actually when I first started at Fort Bend, I had a trailer. And so I had a play therapy room at the end of the trailer. You remember my trailer. It was very nice. I liked my trailer. I had my own AC, my own bathroom. It was awesome.
She was spoiled.
I was, I really was. Didn't have to interact with anybody. I got to have peace and quiet. But at one end, I had a play therapy room, and then in the middle, I had a desk where a volunteer sat, and she would help me with stuff. And the volunteer, Karen Wild, she was always so funny because I'd bring this little boy back, and he was about 5 or 6, and he would clear the shelves. I mean, there would be nothing left on the shelves. All these buckets dumped everything on the floor. Like a little tornado, and she would feel so bad for me. She'd come in afterwards and be helping me pick up, and oh my gosh, Karen, I'm like, it's what he's got to do. By the end of therapy, we actually ended up bringing his mom into therapy with him, and he was living with grandparents. And his mom came to a few sessions, and not that she made any progress, honestly, at all, because she didn't go for her own therapy. She just came to a couple with him. But it made such a difference in his life. He was so touched that she came to therapy that by the end, we sat at this little table and we had donuts with Mom. That's what he wanted for his graduation, was donuts. And we had donuts and we played, and then we got up to leave and he said, oh, Miss Karen, there's a paper towel on the table. Should we throw that away? We went from room wreck to, there's a paper towel left on the table. Talk about progress, that's big. Just because Mom came into the room. I really believe that that's what it was. He needed that attention from Mom. So other things that you see in the play therapy room, lots of confusion about good and bad with abused kids, because oftentimes they've seen police officers or CPS workers come and yell at their parents or take their parents away in handcuffs. So hence the police uniform. A lot of kids struggle with that and they'll play good cop or bad cop until they figure out the cop is there to protect them. Lots of invisibility. If you're being abused, you don't think anybody sees. You know, nobody's doing anything, so I guess nobody sees what's going on with me. You feel invisible. And so when we're in the play therapy room, a lot of what you do is reflect back. Oh, you're choosing to play with that. And you don't label things either. So it's a lot of this and that and those, because you want them to be able to be creative. If I label something a marker, then all of a sudden it's a marker and not a sword. So you want them to come up with those things. So anyway, you know, you'd be, what was it? Oh, invisibility. You'd be reflecting back, oh, it looks like you feel angry, or you're using that to do this. And they, you know, it makes them very uncomfortable because you're seeing them. But they get used to it, and then they're like, oh, okay, somebody really cares. Somebody's here for me. So it's a very healing thing just to see them and pay attention to them. Lots of loss of control issues in the play therapy room, which is what that kid was doing with room wreck. He had no control whatsoever. Lots of helplessness. You know, can you do this for me? Can you fix that? What we do in the play therapy room with play therapy is let's do it together. So you're not taking charge, you're actually empowering the child. So, you know, those times when they come to me, can you tie my shoes? You know, I can't, but I bet we could figure it out together. So you pull this, I'll pull that, and we do, oh, look what we did. And then before you know it, they're tying their own shoes going, oh, look what I did. Yay, good for you. The sexualized behavior, sometimes puppets are doing things to each other. They'll act out their stories with puppets or with anatomically correct dolls in the play therapy room. Medical kits are very telling. So I've had a lot of kids use medical kits, and they'll insert syringes or try to into the girl's vagina to show sexual abuse. So a lot of sexualized play. I've had kiddos get on this and act out things, the little bot bat. So they'll use that as a person and be on top of it. So lots of different ways that they'll show sexualized stuff.
What do you do when if they start doing that during the therapy? You just let it go on, or do you intervene?
If it's not re-traumatizing, I let it go on. If it feels like it's healing and they're working through something, you let it go on. If it feels like, I've had kids that just started sobbing and crying, well, that's when you put a stop to it. Or you try to get them to use their imagination to create a better ending. So, to give them healing. So, what could somebody have done to help you in that situation? Or what could somebody do if you want to keep it in the metaphor? That little baby's really sad and hurting. What could somebody do to help? And sometimes they'll pull me in. You need to take care of that baby. You take the baby. Okay, what do I do with the baby? You want to do this and hold it and love it? Yeah, put it up on your shoulder and pat it and love it. So they'll come up with a healthier ending. And they really do. It's amazing. Like I was talking about that little boy before, sometimes as a therapist you feel really powerless in there and you feel like you're not doing anything. But sometimes it's just giving them the space to do the healing. It's a safe space. They know they can do whatever they need to do in there. And I always have 3 rules for my playroom, but I hardly ever have to tell kids. It's amazing. My rules are you don't hurt yourself, you don't hurt me, and you don't purposely hurt the toys. Very, very rarely have I ever had to say those out loud because they know. Kids just know. They know they shouldn't hurt themselves. Every once in a while I've had some kids climb on that cabinet. Ooh, you can't do that. That's dangerous for you. Don't want you getting hurt in here. Had a couple kids swing a sword at me, and I'm like, oh, Miss Karen's not for hitting, but we can hit the Bobo doll. Give them an alternative. You can hit this or you can hit that, but not me. Maybe a couple times I've had kids break crayons, but it's been very rare over 20 years. So kids just naturally know how to rein themselves in. Any questions about that? No? All right, so the benefits is they become responsible for their own behaviors. You're empowering them. They develop creative solutions for things that I would never think of. They develop respect for others and self-acceptance, so they know that you're seeing them and you're accepting them for who they are. When I get kids in there, like today I had a kid, somebody told her a bad word and she came in my session, she was like, what's a bad word? It's the B word. And here you can say the B word, because you're not calling me one, and you're not calling you one, you're just telling me about something, and it's okay. I'm not going to judge you. You're not going to get in trouble anyway. So that self-acceptance and acceptance from others is so valuable. They learn to express their feelings, because if they're going at something with the sword, ooh, you're angry. No, I'm not. I'm frustrated. Oh, you're frustrated. Great. Okay. They're learning to label them. And it's great. I love it when kids correct me, because that means that they're paying attention and they really know how they feel. Cultivates empathy. Empathy for me, my empathy for them. It's reciprocal. They learn social skills, so they learn how to play nicely. Especially if you get them in a group, because you can do group play therapy. They learn how to negotiate things with others. And just self-efficacy. They can do things on their own and feel good about it. When they're struggling with something, and there's so many times that I'm like, oh, just let me help you. But you don't. As a therapist, you sit back and you go, if you need help, you can ask. And very rarely do they ask. They'll keep struggling and struggling and struggling. But when they finally get it, it's like, eureka. The expressions on their face, it's priceless. So they've learned that they can do something on their own. Sand tray there's lots of different things that can be considered play therapy, but they're also on their own. So sand tray is one of those. You can use sand as part of play therapy, but there's also like a separate credential for sand tray therapy. So sand tray, let's see some interesting things in here. Basically, you have a lot of figures, and you tell kids you can make a picture in the sand of anything you want, or sometimes you give them a topic. Make your world or something like that. This one, you can see some light. So light is typically hope, so you're looking for kind of symbolic things. There's a bridge, which is hopeful. Religion, but then there's some scary things, like this little troll guy. There's some liquor bottles. That's what that is. So you're looking for kind of themes that go on in the sand. You never want to assume, just same with art, you never want to assume what's going on for a child. I can tell you, I think I've been right once, once ever, about a sand tray. Because while they're creating it, I'm thinking in my head, what does that mean? But after they're done, I'll always ask a kid, do you want to share with me what that means to you? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. There was one time where a little girl had been abused in an apartment complex, and when she was building, I'm like, looks like an apartment complex, looks like an apartment complex. And she got done, and I said, do you want to share with me what this is? What's the apartment complex? I was like, man, I was right once. But usually I'm not. Usually it's totally symbolic to them, and it means something totally different. But if they share with you, you really get insight into what's going on in their life. Go ahead. Now this is the one that's just amazing. I started to tell you all early. So I had these two little girls that I was working with. They were both in foster care, and I was also working with the mom. This is a story about the importance of doing what you say you're going to do and how much it means to these kids. So we had a family therapy session where we did sand tray. So two girls, I think they were about 6 and 8, they did this one with mom. And we spent the whole session, you can see how crowded it is, they put tons of stuff in there, right? About 6 months later, and honestly, about 6 months to the day later, we were supposed to do another family therapy session. Well, mom never showed up. We didn't know where she was. The kids were devastated. And I said, you know what? What do you guys want to do with the rest of the time we have? I said, we want to do sand in your office. All right, let's go do sand. I'm going to let you do whatever you want to do today, because they were just devastated. They came in my office and started making this one. And I'm sitting there watching them going, gosh, this looks familiar. Wow, this looks familiar. I don't know why, but it looks familiar. They left my office. We later found out mom had a flat tire. She broke down the road and didn't have a cell phone, so she couldn't call us. But she was on her way to the visit. So she had the best of intentions, but didn't make it there. But if you look, these girls remembered 6 months to the day. Look at the square, look at the square. Look at the ring of stones, ring of stones. We've got the altar and the altar. What else? I mean, there's just so many similarities.
The circular thing in the middle.
This?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a lifesaver.
Yeah.
So this one and that one. So almost really identical. The bridge. So tons of similarities between these two. I couldn't believe how much they had replicated it without mom there. 6 months later. But look how empty it is without mom. So anybody who tells you that these biological parents don't matter to these kids, this shows it right here. And when I figured this out after they left, I went back through their file and dug out that picture and was like, wow. Brought it to the next family session and I said, you guys look at this, what do you think? And they said, all of this is where mom was missing. 6 and 8. So, sand tray can be very powerful. Very, very powerful. I just couldn't believe 6 months. That's amazing. I couldn't do something that I did 6 months ago. I don't know about you guys. I'd never remember. But they did. So they ended up getting reunited with mom, so it was a happy ending, but it took a long time. They were in foster care a couple years. So, go ahead. Art is very powerful, especially with teenagers. Anybody really, but teenagers really love it because they get to be creative. This was a piece that I did with a girls group. And what we did was we all did our own self-images. Then we passed them to our neighbors and asked them for feedback about what they thought about it. And this little girl, she's probably 12 going on 17. And she drew this of herself and then we passed it around. We had like 3 or 4 group members. And they all gave her feedback about it. Looks like you're not there. You think more about your clothes than you. And she got her paper back and read all the comments that they'd written on the back and she was like really moved. It really made a shift in her and in her therapy. Because she was in a gang, so you see the crown there and her blue. But she's all in pencil. So she took time to do all the clothes, but not herself. And she was a beautiful girl. You never know it from that picture. Beautiful blonde, blue-eyed girl. Never know it from looking at that. So it actually getting that feedback from other people about how they saw this picture actually helped her to shift and look at herself in a different way in therapy. So art can be very powerful. Dance and movement, and again, art is another specialty that people can specialize in. Dance movement is another one. So it can be incorporated into play or it can be its own separate thing. But dance movement is really good. This is, again, at Fort Bend. So you can see the balls and the mats and the ribbons and stuff. When kids have been sexually abused, there's actually memories that are stored in their body. So it'll feel a certain way. I'm trying to think how to better express it. But I've got kids that they're like, my body just wants to punch or my body wants to kick. Let your body do that. Get that feeling out. Get that movement. Finish the movement that you wanted to do during your abuse, basically. You wanted to punch him, you couldn't punch him. You can punch that bag now. You can go in the movement room and punch. But this gives them a different experience with their body, where they can have a healthy experience through dance, through movement. I played with Nerf bats and stuff.